Today, I am going to analyze this So this is future me here speaking. And that was me a day ago. And some of you must be wondering why I spent a day analyzing this dataset, especially when I could have done it in like maybe a few minutes or like an hour. But it's not like I had messed it up. Instead, when I started going through this dataset, red flags started to appear. At first, it was very minor, but it kept on appearing within this dataset more and more. So instead of trying to analyze the data to see what certain indicators or risk factors mean for social anxiety, in this video, I would be spotting red flags within this public dataset about social anxiety. So this dataset was crafted to reflect real-world patterns, and it includes high anxiety cases to support research in detection and intervention. Since this is a public dataset about social anxiety with more than 10,000 subjects in Australia, it would be considered as a third-party source because they are connected, organized, and provided by an entity, typically a government agency, research institution, or specialized data aggregators, other than yourself or your own organization. In other words, it's just a black box in the sense that its internal process methodologies and raw data inputs used to generate those insights are hidden from the user. And also the entire data is apparently synthetic despite having a connection method. So this alone raised a lot of questions for me, and also that means that I have to check the quality of the dataset first to make sure it's actually usable before analyzing this dataset. So what exactly do I have to check? So first of all, I had to check the completeness of this data, and that means that I had to find if there are any missing values or missing records. So the easiest way to do this is to use the filter function to check for blanks. And to use the filter function, go up to sort and filter and select filter, and at the header row, there should be a bunch of drop-down buttons that appeared on each column. And if I click on one of them down here at the filter section, if I scroll down, and as you can see, there isn't any blank, but if there is a blank within the column, then the blank would appear at the bottom. And just to make sure all of this dataset doesn't have any blank or missing value, just go through every single column using the filter function. So after I went through the entire dataset and found 0 blanks or missing values or data within this spreadsheet, but to make sure that there are indeed 0 blanks or missing values within this dataset, we could use the count blank function. So to use the count blank function, type in equals count blank and bracket and select your range of cells and bracket and enter, and you should get your results here, which in this case shows 0 blank cells, and that along with the filter function confirms there are no missing values within this dataset. And that's quite good for, the completeness of this dataset. And on to the next one that we want to check for is like the accuracy of this dataset. So that just means that I have to check if the data represents reality. And to check for accuracy, I have to verify its source. And of course, I went back to the site where I had gotten this dataset from, and on the website, it did have a link under its source, which seems good at first, but when I clicked on it, the page is not even on there. Besides, when I checked its connection methods, it did say the dataset was compiled using a combination of survey response, self-reported health data, and observational studies. But it didn't reference where they got it from, as in that there weren't any links that directed back to the observational studies. Also, it's unclear whether their survey response or even their self-reported health data were connected by themselves, or were they connected from other research studies, which is a bit unclear. So all of this makes this dataset not really trustworthy, but at least I could still verify how accurate this dataset is by cross-checking with other data or studies. So, as you can tell, there is a bit of a problem with the dataset. Other than that, I have to check the consistency of the dataset. So we will be looking at the formatting and the standardization of the data. And to make sure the formatting and the standardization is correct, so for example here, highlight one of your columns and go up to number formatting and click on the drop down button, and that would allow us to change the cells column into a different number format that you desire. And to make the data consistent, just go through all of the number formats, and if it's incorrect, then change the number formatting as demonstrated. So now all of the formatting and standardization of the data is consistent, and now I have to check for the validity of the dataset. So to check for the validity of the dataset, highlight one of the columns, go up and click on the data tab and go down to data validation and click here. So in this case, we want to allow whole number and then type in 1 for minimum and type in 120 and OK, and go up here and click on circle invalid data, and it will circle any invalid data found within this column. And I have to go through every single one of them to make sure that the column contains the correct type of data, as well as to make sure it's within a range of data or follows a predefined rule. So after I went through all of this, there is no problem. So that's very good for the validity of the data. So now we have to check for the uniqueness of the data, and that means that we had to ask, are there duplicates within this dataset? So to check for the uniqueness, I had to identify if there are any duplicate records within this dataset. And to identify if there are any duplicates within this dataset, then we would have to create a new column where we combined all of the text within a row and use the conditional formatting to identify the duplicates from this newly created column. So select a new column and type in duplicates and enter. And to combine all of the text within a single row, use the concat function. So just type in equals concat and bracket and select the range of cells and bracket and enter. And as you can see here, the text are combined from the selected range of cells. And now just copy it down to the other cells and then select all of your cells and go up to conditional formatting and highlight cells rules and go down to duplicate values. And a new window would pop up asking for a new formatting rule. And in this case, if the selected range has a duplicate, the cells would be highlighted red, and click OK. And as you can see here, there isn't any duplicates within this dataset since there are no cells highlighted red. And if you want to make sure that there is definitely no duplicate within this dataset, then use the remove duplicate function. So first of all, select the entire dataset and click on the data tab and go down to remove duplicates and click on it. And in this case, I want to select all of the columns since there isn't any identifiers within this dataset. So I had to select all of the columns to make sure there isn't any overlap within the dataset and select OK. And as you can see here, there is no duplicate values found within the dataset. And now we had to check for the timelessness and the freshness of the dataset. And that means that we had to ask, is the data up to date? So that really depends on what subject or questions you are looking for. But the usual consent for a public health data, scientific research, or general studies, as long as it's at least less than 5 years, it would be considered to be timeless. But sometimes, at most, the dataset should be less than 10 years is considered to be fine. So in this case, this dataset was connected from 2019 to 2022. So it would be considered somewhat timeless or fresh since it first started to be connected more than 5 years ago. At the same time, its latest connection was less than 5 years ago. Therefore, this dataset was considered to be somewhat fresh. So after we checked the timelessness and the freshness of the data, we had to check for the relevance and the representativeness of the data. That means that we have to ask, is the data useful? And that really depends on what you are looking for. But in this case, the question that I would be looking for is, how does AI help to identify potential subjects with social anxiety, as well as providing potential interventions for those who have social anxiety in Australia? Since on the website where I had gotten this dataset from also said that this dataset could be used as a material for training machine learning, and as I said before, it claims to support research in detection and intervention. Unfortunately, this dataset isn't really relevant to social anxiety. Why? Because these indicators like heart rate, breathing rate, sweating levels, and dizziness are also linked to other anxiety disorders or any specific phobias. So in a way, this dataset is not relevant to social anxiety. By definition, social anxiety disorder is a chronic mental health condition characterized by intense, persistent fear of being watched, judged, or embarrassed in social situations. But this dataset didn't state these indicators were measured and connected when the subjects were during a social situations. And also, you might have noticed that there isn't any baseline for the heart rate, breathing rate, or even sweating levels within this dataset. So how are we supposed to know when someone with a social anxiety disorder during a social situation, would their heart rate or breathing rate or sweating levels change? So how are we supposed to know if this dataset is about social anxiety, or even if any of these subjects have social anxiety? Also, the risk factors like caffeine intakes and family history are somewhat linked to the social anxiety, but it's also linked to other anxiety disorders and phobias. So there are probably other better risk factors that could be included within this dataset. And for the interventions, all of this could help to prevent social anxiety. Since physical activities had a negative correlation with social anxiety, that means that if the physical activities increases, the likelihood for social anxiety decreases. And for the sleeping hours, it could also help in the intervention of social anxiety. As the sleeping hour increases for the subject, the likelihood for them to get social anxiety decreases, which are relevant to social anxiety. But the problem with it is that all of this intervention could be used for other anxiety disorders or even any other health problems or mental disorders. So it would be really nice to see if there are any interventions that mainly focuses on preventing social anxiety, like social skills training. And also I had checked the demographics in this dataset and compared it with Australia's demographic. As you can see, it's really skewed. So overall, this dataset is not representative of the Australian demographics, as the sample demographics in this dataset is not reflective to the demographics of Australia. And this dataset is not relevant to social anxiety, as the dataset's risk factors and interventions also overlaps with general anxiety disorder and other phobias. So is this dataset usable to reflect real-world patterns? That includes high anxiety cases to support research in detection and intervention? No, it doesn't.